Hollywood taught audiences to admire these men. They were the perfect husbands, beloved fathers, charming gentlemen, and untouchable legends. But behind closed doors, a very different story was unfolding. A celebrated star was accused of terrifying the woman he claimed to love. A television hero left his own children with memories they never escaped. Another icon spent decades hiding behind an image so polished that almost no one questioned it. When memoirs, court records, and family testimonies finally surfaced, they revealed something far darker than gossip. These are the private histories Hollywood couldn't keep hidden forever. Number 1. Sean Connery. In 1965, right at the peak of his James Bond fame, Sean Connery sat down for an interview with Playboy magazine and stated on the record that he saw no issue with striking a woman. It wasn't a misquote or a comment taken out of context. 22 years later, sitting across from Barbara Walters in 1987, he was given a clear opportunity to retract that statement. Instead, he calmly stood by it. For decades, the public largely dismissed these interviews as an extension of his tough guy, alpha male cinematic persona. But the actual weight of that mindset was carried by those closest to him. In her 2006 autobiography, his first wife, Diane Cilento, pulled back the curtain on the immense psychological pressure of their marriage. She didn't just describe a difficult relationship. She outlined an environment defined by deep instability and a severe imbalance of power. Cilento wrote about losing her sense of self living in a space where control was constantly exerted and her own identity was systematically diminished. What makes this situation particularly compelling to analyze isn't just what happened out of the public eye, but how much was openly admitted. We often assume that toxic environments behind closed doors are heavily guarded secrets. Yet here, the ideology that fueled that domestic distress was broadcast to millions. The media and audiences simply chose to focus on the tailored suits and the gentleman spy charm, glossing over the reality of a man who felt entirely justified in his behavior. It would take many more years before he offered any sort of public distancing from those early comments, leaving behind a legacy where the polished icon on screen stood in stark contrast to the reality his family had to navigate. Number 2. George C. Scott. George C. Scott won an Academy Award for embodying ultimate discipline and military stoicism as General Patton. On screen, he was the absolute picture of authority and command. But for those sharing his private life, especially during his heavy struggles with alcohol, control was the last word they would ever use to describe him. Ava Gardner's recollections of their time together paint a picture of relentless anxiety. In her own accounts, she described a profound and terrifying shift in his personality whenever he drank. Their relationship wasn't the kind of passionate, stormy Hollywood romance the press loved to invent. It was a highly volatile environment where her basic safety was constantly in question. The unpredictable atmosphere escalated to a point where Gardner ultimately required hospital treatment for severe injuries sustained during his outbursts. The distress she endured was so palpable that even other powerful industry figures, most notably Frank Sinatra, reportedly tried to step in to offer her protection from Scott. Yet the broader public remained largely unaware of this dynamic. They revered him for his intense presence, often confusing the fierce aggression of his acting with the actual strength of his character. What remains striking about Scott's legacy is the heavy disconnect between the respect he demanded from audiences and the fear he instilled in his partners. The women who knew him best didn't see a disciplined general or a brilliant, dedicated artist. Through their eyes, we see the terrifying reality of living with a man whose internal instability turned their daily lives into a state of constant, quiet survival. Number 3. Bing Crosby. For decades, Bing Crosby's voice was the very definition of home and comfort. He was the ultimate American patriarch, the man who crooned "White Christmas" and projected an aura of effortless, gentle warmth. But the reality of growing up inside the Crosby household was far removed from that cozy holiday image. The fracture in his public persona happened in 1983 when his eldest son, Gary Crosby, published a memoir detailing his upbringing. Gary didn't describe a warm father. He recounted an environment of intense fear and rigid, uncompromising discipline. He wrote about the constant threat of a metal-studded belt, an object that came to symbolize a household ruled by intimidation rather than affection. This strict, heavily punitive atmosphere took a significant psychological toll. The lingering emotional distress from those early years followed the older Crosby boys into adulthood, contributing to a profound sense of instability that shadowed them for decades. It is important to note that the Crosby family legacy remains fiercely divided on this issue. While some siblings corroborated the heavy burden of their father's discipline, others, particularly his children from his second marriage, firmly rejected Gary's account, remembering Bing as a strict but loving parent. Regardless of the divided perspectives, the release of that memoir fundamentally altered how we view the Golden Era patriarch. It forced audiences to confront an uncomfortable reality. The figures we invite into our homes through a screen are often entirely different people when their own front doors are closed. The collective illusion of the perfect American father was permanently cracked by the very voices of the children he supposedly modeled it for. Number 4. Mickey Rooney. Mickey Rooney built an entire empire on boundless, innocent energy. As America's favorite teenager, Andy Hardy, he was the absolute embodiment of wholesome, small-town charm. But the frantic, relentless energy that made him a box-office giant translated into something far more destructive off-camera. Rooney was married 8 times, a statistic that late-night hosts and tabloids often treated as a long-running Hollywood punchline. Yet behind the easy jokes lay a deeply unsettling reality for the women who stepped into his orbit. His second wife, Betty Jane Reyes, later illuminated the severe emotional and physical toll of their union, describing a domestic life heavily dictated by his explosive temper and intense volatility. Even his first wife, Ava Gardner, who walked away after only a year, noted the suffocating atmosphere of his constant infidelity and unpredictable rage. What makes Rooney's trajectory so jarring to analyze is the sheer dissonance between his cinematic brand and his private behavior. Audiences paid to see a lovable, harmless underdog who could always bring a smile to the room. But the reality of sharing a home with him meant navigating a man whose inner life was incredibly chaotic, heavily burdened by massive gambling debts, and prone to projecting his deep-seated frustrations onto his partners. The funny man persona was a brilliant, lifelong performance. But for the wives who lived behind the curtain, the infectious charm was merely a shield. It masked a domestic environment where the comedy vanished and the laughter always stopped the exact moment he walked through the front door. Number 5. Peter Sellers. Michael Sellers, the son of the revered comedic actor Peter Sellers, once described his childhood as a continuous, exhausting exercise in reading the room. While international audiences marveled at the actor's ability to seamlessly slip into bizarre, hilarious personas on screen, his family lived in dread of which version of him would actually walk through the front door. Behind the brilliant, clumsy slapstick of Inspector Clouseau lay a deeply insecure man whose unpredictable moods dictated the entire emotional climate of his household. His second wife, the actress Britt Ekland, detailed a domestic life defined by extreme jealousy and severe isolation. According to Ekland's accounts, Sellers exerted an overwhelming level of control, systematically attempting to cut her off from her own friends and independence. The psychological pressure inside their marriage was immense. He was prone to rapid, unprovoked emotional outbursts and periods of intense hostility, leaving his family constantly scrambling to appease a man who often seemed completely unmoored from reality. What makes Sellers' case so unsettling to analyze is the realization that his greatest professional asset, his absolute lack of a fixed core identity, was exactly what made him so deeply difficult to live with. The very emptiness that allowed him to flawlessly inhabit any comedic role meant there was no stable foundation for him to be a reliable husband or father. The public celebrated him as an unparalleled master of disguise, never realizing that the comedy itself was the mask hiding a domestic reality paralyzed by constant quiet apprehension. Number 6. Cary Grant. Nobody naturally looked, walked, or spoke like Cary Grant. The character we recognize was a meticulous invention crafted over years to project the ultimate image of relaxed sophistication. But the exact perfectionism required to maintain that flawless facade on screen often translated into a suffocating need for control off-camera. When his fourth wife, Diane Cannon, later wrote about their marriage, she didn't describe a suave, easygoing partner. Instead, she outlined a domestic life defined by intense, exhausting psychological pressure. Cannon recalled a husband who constantly monitored and critiqued her appearance, her reactions, and her behavior. The insecurity driving this dynamic was profound. During their relationship, Grant was deeply invested in supervised LSD therapy, a process he publicly claimed was helping him resolve his own childhood traumas. Yet, according to Cannon, his internal struggles frequently manifested as intense jealousy and unreasonable rigid demands placed directly onto her. This is a crucial distinction when analyzing these historical figures. A highly toxic household doesn't necessarily have to involve thrown objects or physical altercations. Sometimes the damage is the result of quiet, relentless emotional erosion. For the movie-going public, Cary Grant was a man who always knew exactly what to say, projecting an effortless charm that made everyone feel at ease. For Cannon, living with that icon meant existing under the microscope of a man so desperate to maintain order that he slowly dismantled her sense of independence. The public saw a polished gentleman. The reality inside his home was far more complicated, a man whose obsessive need for control turned his own living room into an environment of constant psychological scrutiny. Number 7. Rex Harrison. On screen, Rex Harrison was the quintessential English gentleman. As Professor Henry Higgins in My Fair Lady, he charmed audiences with a crisp aristocratic wit and an air of highly educated elegance. But for the women who shared his life, that famous detachment wasn't just a brilliant acting choice, it was a chilling reality. Harrison's personal history is marked by a profound emotional void that left lasting devastation in its wake. His heavily publicized affair with actress Carol Landis ended in absolute tragedy when she succumbed to overwhelming emotional distress. While Harrison was never directly implicated in the events leading to her passing, the industry, and those close to the situation, were quietly appalled by his subsequent behavior. The remarkable coldness and rapid public distancing he displayed in the immediate aftermath revealed a severe lack of empathy. This pattern of deep emotional neglect was echoed years later by his wife, the acclaimed actress Rachel Roberts. Her later recollections of their marriage did not describe loud physical volatility, but rather a suffocating atmosphere of disdain and abandonment. She detailed a relationship heavily defined by his contempt, a dynamic that left her entirely isolated. For Roberts, the immense psychological toll of trying to reach a partner who was fundamentally unresponsive only accelerated her own tragic decline into severe, prolonged instability. Harrison's specific brand of toxicity is complex to analyze because it wasn't explosive. It was an absolute absence of warmth. The damage within his domestic life was rooted in a quiet, relentless indifference. Audiences paid for tickets to see a man of supreme sophistication completely unaware that the very emotional detachment they found so charming on camera was exactly what broke the women who tried to love him in private. Number 8. Oliver Reed. For decades, the British media enthusiastically packaged Oliver Reed's absolute loss of control as premium entertainment. On late-night talk shows and in countless tabloid features, his deeply erratic behavior and perpetual volatility were celebrated as the ultimate hallmark of a lovable, larger-than-life rogue. He was the industry's favorite hellraiser, a man whose chaotic public spectacles were met with applause and roaring laughter. But the fundamental problem with branding extreme instability as a personality quirk is that someone eventually has to live with the consequences of it. Behind closed doors, the behavior that audiences found so endlessly amusing created an atmosphere of severe intimidation for his family. The reality of sharing a home with Reed was not a humorous anecdote. It was a deeply exhausting existence, dictated by unpredictable shifts in mood and an ever-present sense of underlying threat. Those closest to him were forced into a constant state of hypervigilance, navigating a domestic environment where emotional safety was simply non-existent. What makes Reed's legacy so crucial to reevaluate is the undeniable complicity of the media. By eagerly transforming his destructive habits into a highly profitable brand, the press and the public effectively silenced the distress of the people who actually had to endure him off camera. The collective willingness to look the other way sent a very clear message: as long as a man remains entertaining, his private transgressions will be forgiven, or worse, entirely ignored. The public willingly bought into the myth of the charming, boisterous bad boy. In doing so, they completely overlooked the grim reality that the exact same behavior which made him a television legend made his own home a place of profound fear. Number 9. Richard Burton. Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor didn't just have a marriage. They had a highly publicized brand built on the idea of uncontrollable passion. The media eagerly sold the public a narrative where shattered hotel rooms, massive diamonds, and screaming matches were simply the natural byproducts of true, fiery love. But when we look past the glamorous headlines and examine the reality of their domestic life, that romantic illusion quickly collapses. The dynamic between Burton and Taylor was not a cinematic epic. It was a deeply toxic cycle fueled by intense jealousy and staggering levels of substance abuse. Those who worked closely with the couple didn't describe a legendary romance. Instead, they recounted an exhausting environment of profound emotional and physical instability. Burton's severe volatility created a household where unpredictable, explosive confrontations were the daily baseline, leaving lasting psychological distress on everyone caught in their immediate orbit. What makes Burton's case so crucial to unpack is how actively the entertainment industry rebranded severe domestic dysfunction into a marketable fantasy. The press took a relationship rooted in deep psychological pressure and sold it to the world as passion. They masked the very real trauma of a highly destructive relationship under a veneer of glamour. The tragedy of their union wasn't just the profound damage they inflicted on each other behind closed doors. It was the way the public was trained to look at an incredibly unsafe, volatile environment and call it the ultimate Hollywood love story. Number 10. Marlon Brando. On screen, Marlon Brando was celebrated for his unparalleled ability to access raw, emotional truth. As the pioneer of method acting, he brought a level of intense, brooding vulnerability to cinema that fundamentally changed the industry. But the profound empathy he could summon for a camera was glaringly absent inside his own home. Behind the gates of his private estate, Brando cultivated an environment of extreme chaos and psychological manipulation. His numerous marriages and relationships were defined by suffocating unpredictability. For the women in his life, and especially for his children living with him, meant navigating a man who wielded his shifting moods and emotional detachment as weapons of control. He was a deeply fractured patriarch who consistently failed to provide the basic foundation of a stable, secure household. The true cost of this intense domestic instability was ultimately paid by the next generation. The heavy burden of growing up inside such an emotionally turbulent atmosphere left his children grappling with severe, lifelong distress. The highly publicized unraveling of his family in the 1990s, marked by profound legal catastrophes for his son Christian and the devastating emotional decline of his daughter Cheyenne, stands as a grim testament to the toxic environment he fostered. The public revered him as a misunderstood genius, a cinematic titan who tore down the artifice of old Hollywood. But for those who actually inherited his name, the legacy wasn't artistic brilliance. It was the enduring weight of surviving a household where the man celebrated as the greatest actor of his generation was entirely incapable of playing the role of a protective, stabilizing father. Number 11. Jerry Lewis. For decades, Jerry Lewis was the very face of American philanthropy. Every Labor Day, he stood in front of national television cameras sweating and pleading for donations to help sick children. Through these telethons, he cultivated an almost untouchable aura of supreme compassion. But the profound irony of his legacy is that the man who dedicated his public life to championing children was seemingly incapable of showing basic warmth to his own. When his eldest son, Gary, eventually spoke out about his upbringing, he didn't just describe a busy, distant Hollywood dad. He detailed a household governed by deliberate cruelty. According to Gary, his father was a man who used humiliation as a primary parenting tool, creating an environment where his children felt constantly on edge and entirely unloved. Extensive accounts later gathered by publications like Vanity Fair corroborated this incredibly dark atmosphere, painting a consistent portrait of a patriarch who actively weaponized his immense power to control and demean those trapped in his immediate orbit. What makes analyzing Jerry Lewis so unsettling is the sheer scale of the public deception. When the entire world actively crowns someone a saint, it becomes nearly impossible for their victims to be heard. How do you convince the public that the beloved humanitarian weeping on stage is the exact same person orchestrating a deeply intimidating toxic environment in his own living room? The public eagerly bought into his televised empathy, completely missing the fact that his greatest performance wasn't his slapstick comedy. His greatest performance was convincing America he was a savior, while his own family lived in fear of the moment the cameras finally turned off. Number 12. Charlie Chaplin. For nearly 90 years, a staggering piece of Hollywood history sat locked away and forgotten inside a bank vault. When the 1927 divorce filings of Lita Grey were finally unearthed, they completely fractured the carefully guarded myth of cinema's most beloved underdog. Charlie Chaplin built a global empire playing the sweet, innocent tramp, but the man described in those 50 pages of legal documents was a figure of overwhelming power and relentless control. Grey was only 16 years old when they married. Her accounts didn't just outline a failing relationship, they detailed a deeply predatory dynamic. According to the court filings, Chaplin subjected his young wife to severe psychological manipulation and profound emotional cruelty. Most disturbingly, the documents outlined harrowing ultimatums and extreme medical coercion regarding her bodily autonomy, painting a picture of a man entirely willing to risk a teenager's safety to protect his own highly profitable image. The industry's immediate reaction in the 1920s was to launch a massive campaign to discredit Grey, successfully preserving Chaplin's legendary status for generations. What makes these rediscovered documents so critical to analyze today is that they finally give a voice back to the girl who was systematically silenced by a powerful studio machine. We are forced to look at one of the founding fathers of modern entertainment and acknowledge an incredibly dark reality. The archives reveal that his greatest accomplishment might not have been his groundbreaking comedy, but his remarkable ability to hide profound off-screen cruelty in plain sight.